Okay, so have you ever had that feeling like every few years, everything just goes haywire with your marketing?
Yeah.
Like suddenly it's not working like it used to.
Right.
Sales just kind of stall out. Campaigns that were doing amazing, completely tank, and you're spending money on ads that seem to just vanish into thin air.
It's so frustrating.
Yeah, does that sound familiar?
Oh, absolutely.
I feel like it happens to every business owner I know.
It really does. It's like clockwork almost.
Yeah.
You get comfortable with a certain approach and bam, the rug gets pulled out from under you.
And then you're left scrambling trying to figure out what went wrong and what to do next.
And usually the first instinct is to find some quick fix.
Uh-huh.
You know, a new hack or a shiny new tactic.
Yeah.
But that rarely solves the underlying problem.
Right. And that's exactly what we want to dive into today.
Okay.
We're not going to sit here and just like complain about the marketing chaos.
Yeah.
We actually want to equip you with the tools and mindsets to move beyond that constant state of reaction, you know, where you're just like putting out fires all the time.
Just chasing your tail.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Instead, we want to help you build a marketing system that can actually withstand those disruptions.
A system that can bend but not break.
I love that. Okay, so to help us with this kind of upgrade, we're going to be talking about two concepts that might sound a little bit intimidating at first, but trust us, they're actually really practical.
Very practical.
And I think any business owner can benefit from them.
Absolutely.
So those two concepts are systems thinking and FMEA failure modes and effects analysis.
Yeah, no, it sounds kind of
Right.
jargony, right? But it's really not that complicated once you break it down.
So that's our mission for today.
Okay.
To show you how these ideas can really help you, like, almost like disruption-proof your marketing.
Like putting on armor or something.
Yeah, exactly. You're not constantly, like, getting sideswiped.
Exactly, because the reality is disruptions are just part of the game now.
Yeah, like, they're not just, like, these rare events that happen every once in a while.
They're almost becoming the norm, right?
Exactly. And I think the way that a lot of us have been taught to do marketing just isn't designed for that kind of world.
Right. It's all about these individual tactics, like a quick hit of Facebook ads here, a webinar there, a discount sale, and then hoping for the best.
Right. It's like you're running around with this like marketing first aid kit. And you're just like applying these little bandages to different problems.
Yeah, just slapping on Band-Aids, but not really addressing the root cause.
But there's no like underlying structure.
Right.
No cohesive system.
It's like trying to fix a leaky faucet when you've actually got a cracked water main.
I love that analogy. Okay, so that brings us to systems thinking. This is like the first foundation that we need to understand.
All right, so break it down for me. What is systems thinking?
Okay, so imagine your entire business is like this big, complex machine with lots of different moving parts.
Lots of gears and levers.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So instead of just focusing on one specific part that seems to be broken, you want to zoom out and look at the bigger picture.
Got it.
And see how all those different parts are interacting with each other.
It's about understanding the relationships between different parts of your business.
Right. And seeing how like a change in one area might actually have like a ripple effect.
Like dominoes.
Exactly. On other parts of the business.
Yeah. And it's about recognizing that your marketing isn't just a bunch of random things you do, right?
Right.
It's a whole process, a system with all these interconnected parts that are working together.
And the really cool thing, I think, is that you probably already use systems thinking in other areas of your life.
I bet you do.
Without even realizing it.
Give me an example.
Okay. So think about planning a road trip.
Okay.
You don't just hop in the car and start driving, right?
Not if you want to get where you're going.
You think about the route you're going to take, potential traffic.
Gas stop snacks.
Yeah, maybe even the weather.
Right. You're looking at all those factors and how they might affect your journey.
Right. You're thinking about all those interconnected elements.
And the same goes for your business, right?
Exactly. Your business exists within this larger economic climate.
Yeah.
You're interacting with customers who have their own systems and motivations and desires.
And your website, your social media, your sales calls, those are all part of that larger system.
And if you ignore those relationships, you might miss those early warning signs that something's about to change.
Right, like those little shifts in the weather that tell you a storm is coming.
And in today's global economy, everything really is connected, right?
Yeah, it's like a giant web.
It's almost like one of those intricate mobiles.
Oh, I love those.
Yeah, where if you touch one piece, it sets the whole thing in motion.
And everything's kind of delicately balanced.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand those, if this happens, then that happens, relationships in your specific business.
It's about thinking a few steps ahead.
Yeah, and that's what systems thinkers are really good at.
So how do they do that? How do they actually identify those if this then that patterns?
Well, they're really good at spotting patterns instead of just reacting to problems.
Give me an example.
Okay, so let's take an example like consumer confidence.
Okay, I know a little about that.
Right, so, consumer confidence is basically how optimistic people are feeling.
About the economy, about their personal finances, right?
Exactly, about the future in general, and we know that consumer confidence can have a huge impact on businesses.
Especially businesses that sell things people don't absolutely need.
Right, things that are like wants rather than needs.
Like luxury items, travel, entertainment, those kinds of things.
Exactly. So let's say consumer confidence starts to decline.
People are feeling a little less secure about the future.
Right. Maybe they're worried about the economy or their jobs.
And so they start cutting back on spending.
Right. And that could show up in your business in a lot of different ways.
Like what?
Well, you might see a decrease in traffic to your website.
Makes sense. People aren't browsing as much.
Right. Fewer people might be signing up for your email list.
Because they're not in buying mode.
Right. They're just not as engaged with your social media content.
And ultimately, it can lead to lower sales.
Well, yeah. And if you're not thinking systemically, you might just see those individual problems and think, okay, I need to run more ads.
Or post more on social media.
Yeah, just do more of the same.
But that might not be the solution.
Right, because the underlying problem is actually a shift in consumer behavior.
So a systems thinker would try to understand that shift.
Exactly, and maybe they would think about repositioning their offer to appeal to a more budget-conscious customer, or maybe emphasizing the value and necessity of their product.
It's about being adaptable and understanding the bigger picture.
Right, it's not about just shouting louder when the language of the market has changed.
That's a great way to put it.
So that's one way that systems thinkers approach things differently.
Okay.
They also really understand delays.
Yes, delays. The bane of every marketer's existence.
Right, because in marketing, nothing happens instantly.
Some of the things take time to build up steam.
Right, like you launch a new content strategy. And it takes time for that content to get indexed, to get ranked, to get in front of people.
You're not going to see a surge in traffic overnight.
Exactly, and it's the same with building brand awareness.
Nurturing leads, establishing trust, it all takes time.
And a lot of times, we can get impatient.
Yeah, we want to see those results now.
And we might abandon a strategy too early.
Just before it starts to really pay off.
Because we're not seeing those immediate results.
And I think this is where the analogy of a big ship versus a kayak comes in.
I love that analogy.
It takes a lot longer to turn a big ship around than it does to steer a kayak, right?
Right. So if you're trying to change direction in your business, you need to be patient.
You need to understand that it's going to take time.
And you need to stay the course.
Don't expect to see those results overnight.
And I think that's another key difference between systems thinkers and people who are maybe more tactical in their approach.
They're playing the long game, right?
Right. They have that long-term vision.
And they understand that delay is an inherent part of the system.
Okay, so we talked about patterns, we talked about delays. What's another key element of systems thinking?
Well, I think another big one is understanding those domino effects, or what we call unintended consequences.
Right, because any change you make in your marketing can have ripple effects throughout your business.
It's like throwing a pebble in a pond.
Exactly. Sometimes those ripples are positive.
Sometimes they're not so much.
And sometimes they're unintended.
Right. You might think you're making a small tweak, but it can actually trigger a whole cascade of events.
Give us an example.
Okay, so a common one is cutting customer service costs. You're trying to save money.
Right. Seems logical on the surface.
But what happens if your customers start having problems and they can't get help?
Right. Their satisfaction goes down.
They might start leaving negative reviews.
You might see a higher churn rate.
And that ends up costing you more money in the long run.
Right, so that initial cost-cutting measure actually backfired.
Exactly, because you didn't think about the domino effects.
So how do you avoid those kind of unintended consequences?
I think the key is to slow down.
Okay.
And really think through your decisions before you make them.
Don't just jump in without thinking about the potential ramifications.
Right. Ask yourself what happens next and even what happens after that.
Try to map out those second and third order effects.
Think about all the possible ways this decision could play out.
Because that's what a systems thinker would do.
Absolutely. And the last point I want to make about systems thinkers is that they design their marketing with disruption in mind.
So they're not just hoping for the best.
No, they're actually preparing for the worst.
Right. They're not assuming that everything's going to go smoothly all the time.
They know that disruptions are inevitable, so they build systems that can handle them.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, for one thing, they build flexibility into their plans.
Okay.
They don't create these rigid, set-in-stone marketing strategies.
Right, so it's not like the step-by-step playbook.
No, it's more like a framework that can adapt to changing circumstances.
They're willing to adjust course as needed.
Exactly. And they also diversify their marketing channels.
So they're not putting all their eggs in one basket.
Right. If one channel dries up, they have others to fall back on.
And I think one of the most important things is they document their processes.
Absolutely. So that if someone leaves the team or if there's a sudden disruption, they can keep things running smoothly.
It's like having a backup generator for your marketing.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so we've talked about why a purely tactical approach to marketing can be problematic.
Right.
We've laid the groundwork with systems thinking.
The importance of understanding how all the parts of your business are connected.
Exactly. Now let's talk about that other tool you mentioned.
Okay.
Failure modes and effects analysis, or FMEA.
FMEA. It might sound a little intimidating.
It does. It sounds very, engineering-y.
It does, but it's actually a really helpful tool for any business owner.
So give us, a simple definition of what FMEA actually is.
Okay, so imagine this. You're basically trying to future-proof your marketing.
Okay.
You're trying to identify all the potential ways things could go wrong, and then you're figuring out how to prevent those things from happening.
So it's kind of like a pre-mortem for your marketing?
That's a great way to put it. You're basically asking yourself, if this happens, what's the worst that could happen?
And then how can I stop that from happening?
Exactly. And FMEA provides a structured way to do that.
Okay, so how do we actually apply FMEA to our marketing?
Well, the first step is to identify all the potential failure points in your marketing system.
Okay, so give us some examples.
Okay, so think about your website.
Right.
What could go wrong?
It could crash.
It could crash, especially during a big promotion.
Right.
Your email list could get hacked. Your email deliverability could suddenly plummet.
That would be bad.
A key advertising platform could change its policies overnight.
Right, like Facebook or Google.
Exactly. You really want to brainstorm all the things that could potentially derail your marketing.
Okay, so that's step one.
Right.
Just a big brainstorming session for all the things that could go wrong.
Exactly. And then step two is to score each of those potential failure points.
Okay, so how do we do that?
Well, you want to look at three key factors.
All right.
The first is severity. How serious would the impacts be if that failure actually occurred?
Okay.
And you're going to rate that on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being like the most catastrophic.
Got it. So like a website crash during a huge launch would be a 10.
Exactly right. Then you have occurrence.
Okay.
How likely is it that this failure will actually happen?
Okay, so something that's very unlikely would be like a 1.
Right. And something that's almost guaranteed to happen at some point would be closer to a 10.
Got it. And then the third factor.
The third factor is detection. How easily would you be able to detect this failure before it becomes a major problem?
Okay, so something that's really hard to detect would be like a 1.
Right, like a slow decline in your email open rates over time. Well, something that's very obvious would be like a 10.
Okay, so once you have those 3 scores for each failure point, what do you do with them?
You multiply them together.
Okay.
And that gives you what's called the risk priority number, or RPN. RPN. And the higher the RPN, the more urgent it is to address that potential failure.
So it's like a ranking system for your risks.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
It helps you prioritize which problems to focus on first.
Okay, so what's the final step in the FMEA process?
The final step is to develop solutions and mitigation strategies for those high RPN failure points.
So this is where we actually start taking action.
Right. This is where you build in your safety nets.
Okay.
So, for example, if you identified your website crashing during a promotion as a high risk, your solution might be to invest in more robust hosting.
Okay.
Or have a backup website ready to go.
Got it.
Or if you're worried about email deliverability, you might implement email authentication protocols.
Okay.
Or segment your list more carefully.
So it's all about putting those safeguards in place.
Exactly. You're moving from being a firefighter to being a system architect.
I love that. And I remember in the source material, there was a great example of a bakery that used FMEA to actually weather an economic downturn.
Oh, yeah. That's a great case study.
Can you remind us of that?
So they realized that if the economy took a hit, people might cut back on the pastries.
Right.
So they brainstormed some potential solutions.
Okay.
They introduced a loyalty program to reward their most loyal customers.
Okay.
They started offering subscription boxes to create a more predictable revenue stream.
Smart.
And they even partnered with local coffee shops to expand their reach.
So they were thinking ahead and putting those preventative measures in place?
Exactly. They weren't just waiting for things to go wrong.
They were actively working to make their business more resilient.
And it paid off.
Yeah.
They were able to not just survive the downturn, but actually thrive.
That's a fantastic example.
It shows that FMEA can be really powerful.
Okay, so beyond these like core frameworks, the source material also talks about 5 invisible forces that can really wreck your marketing.
These are the sneaky ones.
Right, so let's dive into those. The first one is feedback loops.
Feedback loops.
Right, so can you explain what a feedback loop is in the context of marketing?
Okay, so in simple terms, a feedback loop is just a cycle of cause and effect.
Okay.
Your actions trigger certain responses, and those responses then feedback into the system, influencing your future actions.
Okay, so it's not just like a one-way street.
Right, it's a continuous cycle.
And can you give us an example of how a feedback loop might play out in marketing?
Okay, so let's say you decide to stop sending emails to your list for a while. Maybe you're busy, or you think it's not worth the effort.
Right.
So you stop sending emails, and at first it might seem like no big deal.
Yeah.
But over time, your audience starts to forget about you.
They're not getting those regular reminders.
Exactly, their engagement drops.
Right.
Then when you finally decide to send an email announcing a sale, it falls flat.
Nobody opens it, nobody clicks.
Exactly, because your list has gone cold.
Right, and you might be tempted to think, oh, email marketing doesn't work.
Right, but that's not the real problem.
Right, the real problem is that you broke the feedback loop.
Exactly, you stop nurturing your audience so they stop responding.
So how do you fix a feedback loop like that?
Well, the key is to trace the sequence of events backward.
Okay.
When something goes wrong, ask yourself, what happened just before that? And what led to that?
So it's like being a detective.
Exactly. You're trying to find the root cause.
And then once you identify the root cause, you can start to make changes.
Right. So in this case, you need to start sending regular emails again.
Get that engagement back up.
Exactly. Rebuild that trust and that relationship with your audience.
Okay, so that's feedback loops.
The first invisible force.
What's the second one?
The second one is delays.
Right, which we talked about a little bit earlier.
Delays are everywhere in marketing.
Right, we can't expect instant results.
And that's where a lot of people get tripped up.
They give up too soon.
Exactly. They plant the seeds, but they don't water them long enough to see the results.
And the source material uses this great analogy from Mike Mihaljevic.
Tell me about it.
He talks about this concept of the grass ceiling.
The grass ceiling.
Yeah.
I like that.
So imagine you're watering your lawn.
Okay.
And you're watering and watering, but you're not seeing any grass grow.
So frustrating.
Right. So you give up.
Yeah, I've been there.
But what if you had just kept watering for a little bit longer?
What if the grass was just about to sprout?
Right below the surface.
I see the grass ceiling.
The grass ceiling, right? And it's the same with marketing.
You have to be patient.
Right. You have to keep nurturing those leads.
Keep creating that content.
Keep building those relationships.
Even when you're not seeing immediate results.
And that's where tracking your metrics can be really helpful.
Absolutely. Because you can start to see those early signs of progress.
Right. Even if you're not seeing those big wins yet.
It can help you stay motivated.
And stay the course.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about feedback loops. We've talked about delays. What's the third invisible force?
The third one is unintended consequences.
Unintended consequences, the things we didn't see coming.
Right. And these are closely related to those domino effects we talked about earlier.
It's all about understanding the ripple effects of your actions.
And sometimes those ripple effects can be negative.
Even if you had good intentions.
Give us an example.
Okay, so a classic example is slashing your prices.
Okay.
You know, you're trying to boost sales.
Right.
But what happens if you train your customers to expect those lower prices?
Right. They might not be willing to pay full price again.
Exactly. And it could also devalue your brand.
Make it look less premium.
Right. And what if your competitors also lower their prices?
Then everyone loses.
Exactly. So how do you avoid these unintended consequences?
Well, I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier about slowing down.
Yes.
Really thinking through your decisions.
Pressure test them.
Right?
Think about all the possible outcomes.
Don't just react impulsively.
Right. Because sometimes the most obvious solution is not the best solution.
Okay, so that's unintended consequences, the third invisible force.
What's number 4?
Number 4 is low detection.
Low detection. Okay.
So this is about missing those early warning signs.
Right, those little cracks in the foundation.
Something's not quite right.
And they can be easy to miss if you're not paying attention.
Right, because everything might seem to be going smoothly on the surface.
Yeah, you're hitting your numbers, you're feeling good.
But then suddenly...
Bam! Everything falls apart.
Right, you have a huge drop in leads or sales.
And you're left scratching your head, wondering what happened.
But if you had been paying closer attention, you might have noticed those early indicators.
Those little red flags.
Right. Maybe your website engagement was slowly declining.
Or your email open rates were dropping.
Or your conversion rates were slipping.
But you were too busy looking at the big picture numbers.
Right. And by the time you noticed the problem,
it was too late.
It was already a 5-alarm fire.
So how do we avoid falling into the trap of low detection?
Well, I think the key is to create a simple dashboard.
Okay.
That tracks the most important metrics for your marketing.
The vital signs.
Exactly. And you want to be checking that dashboard regularly.
Like a doctor checking a patient's pulse.
Exactly right. Ideally on a weekly basis.
And understand what normal looks like for your business.
Right. So you can quickly spot any deviations.
Exactly. And setting up alerts can also be really helpful.
Alerts?
Yeah. Like if a key metric drops below a certain threshold.
Okay.
You get an email notification or a text message.
So it's like a smoke detector for your marketing.
That's a great analogy.
Right. You don't wait for the whole house to be on fire.
You want to catch those small problems early.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about feedback loops. We've talked about delays, unintended consequences, low detection.
What's the last one?
The last invisible force is a lack of collaboration.
Collaboration, or rather the lack thereof.
Right, because it's easy to get stuck in our own little bubble.
Especially as business owners.
Right, we're so focused on our own ideas and our own perspective.
That we forget to ask for help.
Or to get feedback from others.
Exactly, and that can be a big mistake.
Because other people might see things that we're missing.
They might have a fresh perspective.
Right. They might be able to spot those blind spots.
And sometimes the best solutions come from unexpected places.
So what's the solution here?
Talk to people.
Talk to people.
Yeah, talk to your team members.
Okay.
Talk to your customers. Talk to other business owners.
Get their feedback.
Ask for their opinions.
And be open to hearing what they have to say.
Even if it's not what you want to hear.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
We've talked about the limitations of a purely tactical approach to marketing.
Right.
We've talked about the importance of systems thinking.
Understanding the big picture.
Exactly. We've talked about how to use FMEA to identify and address potential failures.
Being proactive.
And we've talked about these 5 invisible forces that can really trip us up.
The sneaky saboteurs.
Exactly. So what are some actionable steps that our listeners can take right now to start building a more resilient marketing system?
Okay, so the first thing I would do is map out your existing marketing system.
Okay, literally draw it out.
Yeah, get a whiteboard or a big piece of paper.
Okay.
And list all your key marketing activities. And try to visualize how they connect to each other.
So like a flow chart.
Exactly. And then once you have that map, pick maybe 3 critical areas of your marketing.
Okay.
And do a basic FMEA on each one.
So identify those potential failure points, score them, and then come up with solutions.
Exactly. And don't try to do everything at once.
Right. Just focus on the most critical risks.
And then put those safeguards in place.
And then once you've done that, what's next?
Well, I think it's important to remember that your marketing system is not static.
Right. It's always evolving.
Exactly. Yeah. So you want to be reviewing your system map and your FMEA analysis regularly.
Okay. So maybe like quarterly?
Yeah, quarterly is a good cadence.
Just make sure that they're still relevant and effective.
Exactly. And when disruptions do happen,
because they will
try to approach them with a mindset of curiosity rather than panic.
Okay.
Because every disruption is an opportunity to learn.
Right. It's giving you data about the weaknesses in your system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's a chance to make your system even stronger.
So the big takeaway here is that we want to move away from just chasing stability.
Yes,
and instead focus on building resilience.
Building systems that can adapt and evolve.
Exactly. Because in today's world, change is the only constant.
And the businesses that can embrace that change and adapt to it are the ones that are going to thrive.
Okay, so your call to action today, listener, is to start Murphy-proofing your marketing?
Murphy-proofing.
Right. Take those initial steps, understand your system,
identify those weak links,
and start putting those safeguards in place.
Build a marketing machine that's built to last.
Okay, and here's a final thought to leave you with.
Right, Amy.
What's the single most fragile part of your current marketing?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Right. What's the one thing that if it broke would cause the biggest disruption to your business?
Make you lose sleep at night.
Right. And then, once you've identified that thing, ask yourself, what's one small step you could take today?
Just one small step.
To make that thing just a little bit more resilient.
A little bit stronger.
And that's our deep dive for today. Join us next time as we continue this conversation and explore even more practical strategies to help you design a business that not only survives disruption, but actually thrives in the face of it. We'll see you then.
See you next time.
Bye.